The night before my first deployment, I sat on the edge of a bunk in a transit barracks and scratched my service number into the inside of my left heel. Nobody told me to do it. It wasn't regulation. The field knife I used was a hand-me-down from my uncle, the handle wrapped in black friction tape that had dried to the texture of old bark. I held the boot in my lap, pressed the tip of the blade against the leather, and cut each digit of my service number one at a time. 6 numbers. I worked right to left because I've always written right to left when I'm carving. A habit from childhood, from the way my grandfather taught me to letter wood. And the grooves came out clean and slanted in a direction that felt natural to me, and probably to no one else alive. It took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock above the door the whole time. Something to keep my hands from shaking. When I was done, I pressed my thumb into the grooves and felt them, the boot on, and didn't think about it again for 9 years. I should explain what the Verith are, or were, before I explain what they did. They were, perfect logic machines. Not in the science fiction way people imagine when they say that phrase. They weren't cruel. They weren't even hostile. Not really, not in the beginning. What they were was thorough. They arrived in our system without warning or declaration, and began cataloging everything they could reach. Atmospheric data, biological samples, radio transmissions going back a century, and eventually people. Not killing, not capturing in any sense we'd normally use that word. Cataloging. They would observe a subject long enough to build what they called a correspondence, a functional replica, indistinguishable, in every measurable way from the original. And then they would release the correspondence back into the population and observe how it integrated. Academic work from their perspective, the most invasive academic work in the history of any two species. First 6 correspondences we identified were detected because they behaved wrong, too perfectly. No fidgeting, no contradictions between stated preferences and observed behavior, no inexplicable loyalty to a bad cup of coffee. The Verith refined their method. By the time they reached me, the correspondences were good enough that 3 had gone undetected for over a year inside active military units. I was 41 years old, a demolition sergeant with 2 deployments behind me and a 3rd pending. The Verith took me during a routine overnight at a survey outpost. A moment so unremarkable I genuinely cannot tell you what I was thinking when it happened. I came back to myself in a white room with no visible seams and a faint electrical smell that reminded me of transformer boxes after rain. Across from me sat a woman in a gray uniform I didn't recognize. She told me what had been done, quietly and without apology. She told me a correspondence had been operating in my place for 17 days. She asked if I could identify anything unique about myself that the correspondence might have replicated incorrectly. I thought about that for a long time. She waited. Long enough that she asked again gently, as though she'd had this conversation before and knew the particular weight of it. Here's the thing about the Verith's cataloging process. It was visual. They photographed everything. Every scar, every callus, the specific way I hold my left shoulder lower than my right when I'm tired, every thread of gray in my beard. Their correspondence would have those things exactly right, dimensionally, but a photograph shows you a groove in leather. It cannot tell you which way the hand moved when it made the groove. It cannot tell you about the grandfather, or the wood lettering, or the specific slant of a right-handed person who had been trained by someone to the other way. Direction isn't a dimension you can photograph. I told the woman I needed to see my left boot. They brought me one of my own boots, taken from the correspondence during its initial assessment. I assume, and I held it in my lap and pressed my thumb into the heel grooves the way I had 9 years before in that transit barracks. The groove walls ran right to left, from the perspective of someone reading the numbers, the way I always carved, the way my grandfather showed me. Then they brought me the correspondence. I want to be careful here because I know how this part sounds. It was me. It was genuinely precisely, unsettlingly me. The same tired set of the shoulders, the same half-inch scar above the left eyebrow from a ricochet in my second deployment, the same way of standing with. The weight shifted to the right hip, when neither position is quite comfortable. 17 days of my life had been lived by that thing, and no one had noticed. Not my unit, not the men I'd trusted with my life for a decade. That detail lands differently than I expected it to, even now. We sat at a table with the woman in gray and two Vareth representatives, pale, segmented, calm in the way that expensive machinery is calm when it has no cause for concern. One of them spoke through a translation pendant that hung at its midpoint, a small oval of brushed metal. It said the correspondence had been performing within acceptable integration parameters. It said the purpose of the exercise was to understand human social cohesion and how identity propagates through a unit under stress conditions. It said this with the same effect it would use to describe barometric pressure. I didn't say anything for a moment. I put my boot on the table. I asked the correspondence to take off its left boot. The Vareth representatives leaned slightly, whatever lean means for something, without a vertebral column, toward each other. The woman in gray went very still. The correspondence looked at me for a long moment with my own eyes, and I looked back with them too. And then it reached down and took off its boot and set it beside mine on the table without another word. I picked up the correspondent's boot first, pressed my thumb into the heel. The grooves were mirrored, right to left from the outside, identical in depth, in spacing, in every measurable dimension. But the cut walls slanted the wrong direction, because whoever had transferred the photographic data into the fabrication process had no way of knowing which way the original knife moved. They'd seen the pattern. They hadn't felt the hand that made it. I set the boot down. I didn't make a speech. I'm not a speech-making kind of person, and there was nothing to say that the boots weren't already saying. I put my own boot back on and laced it and stood up. And I looked at the correspondence one more time. It was looking at its own boot heel, the way a person looks at something that has told them, something they can't take back. The Vareth representative with the translation pendant was quiet for a long time after that. Then it said, in a flat, even way, that the anomaly was consistent with a class of human behavioral data their models had consistently failed to account for, what it termed acquired idiosyncrasy. It meant the small things a person does for no reason except that their grandfather showed them 40 years ago, and they never once questioned the direction. I asked them, through the woman in gray, what they intended to do with this information. The pendant translated a long exchange between the two representatives, and I watched them while I waited, the way you watch something when you're trying to understand its scale. When the pendant spoke again, it said, "Catalog it." I believed them. That's the strange part. I believed that was genuinely all they wanted, to know, not to deploy. It didn't make it better. It didn't give back 17 days. But I understood the Vareth a little more than I had an hour before, and I understood something about myself that I hadn't examined since I was 22 years old, in a transit barracks, watching a clock above a door, and holding my uncle's old knife, carving right to left because that's just how I do it. Because that's how he did it. Because, somewhere behind him, someone else did it the same way for a reason that was probably already forgotten. They released me 3 hours later. I still have both boots, mine and the correspondence. I keep them on the shelf above my bunk, heels facing out. Most mornings I don't look at them. Some mornings I do, and I press my thumb into each set of grooves in turn, feeling the direction of the cut. The Vareth cataloged 9 years of my life. Every scar, every habit, every word I'd said on a monitored frequency. 11 minutes in a transit barracks is what they missed.